So thank you everyone for coming to this seminar, and first start by recognizing the traditional owners of the land on which we stand and meet today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Today we have a very sort of interesting topic, and one which is very timely, on the diplomatic leadership and national climate action, understanding the shifting roles of the US and China. And it comes at a very timely sort of moment when we have the Paris Agreement implemented. The US dramatically reversed course after their national elections. And then we have the big question of whether China will step up to the climate leadership vacuum. So we have quite a distinguished speaker today to shed some light on the topic. I'm sure many people are curious on what the answer to that would be. And I think Robyn has a very distinguished career and made significant contributions, especially in the field of international climate politics. In the short time period that we have, it will be difficult to do justice to sort of give a bio, but I'll give a very abridged version. So Robyn is a professor at the School of Social and Political Science, and among others, she's also a supervisor to PhD students, including in this college myself. I can see Stephanie somewhere and others. And I think without much ado, I'll invite Robyn so that she can sort of give us some insights on what she thinks about these very timely topic. Over to you, Robyn.
Thank you very much, Kennedy. I can use this one. Is this getting recorded? Yep, okay. So great powers are the focus of considerable attention because they're indispensable states. And there is this argument in international politics, we see it in practice, that with great power comes great responsibility. It's often referred to as the Spider-Man ethic. But expectations of responsibility or yeah, that would be better, thank you.
My apologies.
Thank you. So those expectations, though, were invariably disappointed. So what I want to question today is this argument that with the Trump administration's defection from the Paris Agreement, it's created a leadership vacuum into which China can, step. Or it can take up the leadership mantle. There's speculation all over the place. And just to quote one, a New York Times report said, Trump hands the Chinese a gift, the chance for global leadership. So the big question is, will China take that step, take up that chance? And so what I want to do today is to kick off by providing a conceptualisation of leadership and then what sort of metrics we need to look for to decide what leadership is in terms of international diplomacy, in large N multilateral negotiations characterised by deep disagreement. Leadership's very hard. And also nationally, in terms of national action. And with those metrics, rather than go through them systematically, because we've got less time than I thought, I'm just going to tell a narrative that's easy to grasp and pull out some of the key metrics. And then wind up with a conclusion by saying why I don't think China's going to step into that leadership vacuum, at least in the short term. So what is leadership? Well, the term in the English language occupies a really wide semantic field. It includes everything from a democratically elected political leader to a dictator, from a front runner in a race to pioneers and innovators in a field, to skilled diplomats and successful bargainers and moral advocates. If leadership is to mean all of those things and it has no explanatory value whatsoever, it's such a slippery fish. So unless we conceptualise leadership and mobilise it and apply it in a sort of tight way, then we might as well look for another concept. So what I've done, I've been reading about leadership for a very long time and working on this area too long that I care to admit. But I think what you can do in terms of a hierarchy, start with a very fundamental grouping of two different types of leadership. I'll call one substantive leadership, and that's what I'm interested in today. The other is positional leadership. Substantive leadership is a social structure, informal or formal, that entails followership. Positional leadership is merely a relative ranking in a field. And they're very important conceptual distinctions. The former, I now conceptualise and define as, this is substantive leadership. It can apply to diplomatic leadership or national leadership vis-a-vis the national community. It's a type of social interaction whereby one or more parties, the leaders, exercise asymmetric influence in guiding, directing, or attracting the support, acquiescence, or compliance of other parties, the followers, either directly or indirectly, in ways that enable collective agency towards the achievement of a collective purpose in a given community, organisation, or group. So the key elements are asymmetric influence in shaping common goals, outcomes. So there's a collective purpose and it enhances collective agency through that asymmetric influence. Now, the nature of the goals that are pursued, the institutional location, the attributes of the leader, these all vary hugely according to context. And we can plot this kind of substantive leadership on a continuum from purely legitimate, which you'll never find in the real world, to purely coercive, like the dictator, which is never purely coercive. So it's a continuum. So this is an analytical construct. We can think of purely legitimate leadership, purely illegitimate, that derives its authority purely through coercion, bribery, and propaganda at one end, and one that actually gets the full and free consent of followers at the other. Now, I can't really find any pure examples of either, but on that continuum, you can say it's relatively more legitimate and relatively less legitimate. So positional leadership, on the other hand, are simply front runners in a race. So you might say in the arms race, Russia has more nukes than the US, or the US is probably more technologically sophisticated, or running in a marathon, we have front runners in a field, or we have a suite of different climate performance indices, which are guided by the goals, norms, principles of the climate regime, where you can plot different states. And that's tricky because there's so many variables there and there's all sorts of normative judgments. But that is a form of positional leadership. Some states consistently appear towards the top of those league ladders. They're positional leaders, right? So the question is, what is the relationship between substantive leadership and positional leadership? They're analytically distinct, but they're often overlapping in practice. First, states that are consistently high on the climate performance index as positional leaders need to be able to practice substantive leadership at the national level to maintain that ranking. So nationally, you need durable and legitimate policies that endure despite changes of government, right? That means you've managed to bring the community along with you. There may be opposition, but it's minor, right? But that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to exercise diplomatic leadership in attracting followers in your proposals in international negotiations. If you find horizontal emulation by other states following what you're doing because of your directional leadership, your positional leadership there, then that becomes substantive because you can actually point to followers. And so what we find in the international negotiations, being a positional leader, which means you're also a substantive national leader, doesn't necessarily translate into diplomatic leadership. However, I can guarantee that if you're a laggard, you're unlikely to have any diplomatic credibility. So your national policies, whatever they are, need to be at least credible, if not high in the performance ranking, to have diplomatic credibility. And that's demonstrated time and time again through surveys and through just watching negotiations in practice. And by diplomatic leadership is simply applying that conceptualisation of leadership and filtering it through the institution of multilateralism. Just like when I think about national leadership, you have to filter it through the nature of national institutions. So, indispensable states, great powers, have a head start in the diplomatic leadership stakes because they have superior diplomatic strength, intellectual resources, ability to resource public goods like climate finance, assist other countries to attend negotiations, but above all, they have this superior power to create and to destroy, or productive power in putting proposals forward. If they do it, people listen more because it means if we agree, we're likely to get their participation in the agreement, but they also have a veto power, blocking power, which they can use time and time again. So that doesn't mean, though, that they can necessarily get their own way, because the thing about my conceptualization of leadership is that it's very important that the leader or leaders, because it can be distributed, are working for a collective purpose rather than purely their own ends. So you must distinguish it from success in pure gardening. That's an interesting slip. Success in pure gardening, I'm trying to imagine what that means. Success in pure bargaining. In a bargaining arrangement, a pure bargaining arrangement, your opponent's preferences are constraints against the realization of your preferences. So your idea is to win, to get as much as your preferences and as little as theirs done. It's a zero-sum game. So pure bargaining is not leadership because you're not guiding folk towards a collective action, a collective purpose where there's shared understanding of what that is, and this is the best means by which we can get there. So it's not just goals, but the means to get there. So you might say that front runners in a race are inducing followership, all the runners are following along, but it's a competitive race. They're out against each other. They're not in a collective project, just like the arms race. So this idea of collective project is important because leadership, when it works and when it's legitimate, not only enables collective, it is collectively empowering because a community can do something it couldn't otherwise do. It also enhances individual agency of parties. Their agency is greater than what it would have been without that leadership sphere, as it were. Whereas a dictatorship often diminishes the agency over those over which it exerts power. It might give a greater agency to some of its those that suck up to the dictator, but literally it actually diminishes agency, and it's very expensive. So with those in mind, we might say, well, how do we operationalize this from the point of view of thinking about diplomatic leadership? So what I'm going to do from now is look at just briefly list the sorts of metrics that one would look to understand, to look for legitimate diplomatic leadership. I won't have time to go into what that means for national leadership because that's institutionally configured differently in different countries, but I'll link it to the national action, which presupposes leadership. So if you're looking for diplomatic leadership, you're looking at the quality and general appeal of the proposals, the role of the role of advocacy, whether it's genuine rather than disingenuous, whether it's furthering the collective good. It doesn't mean that it's ruled out if the advocate is also, if it's also furthering their self-interest. But if it's purely serving their self-interest, then it's disingenuously defended as defending the collective interest. Conformity with multilateral processes, very important. Flexibility and an ability to actually accommodate other parties' red lines. Leadership is not about absolute asymmetric influence. It's relative asymmetric influence where you accommodate others so they can be brought round. Without that, in a large end negotiation of 196 parties, how else can you get an agreement over the line? Contribution to the costs of collective action like climate finance, other bilateral initiatives that may be supportive and helping the larger and diplomatic multilateral effort, the credibility of national action, and yeah, they're the main things. So without any further ado, I'll start the narrative. Now, we all know the story of Copenhagen. I don't want to dig over those coals. We know that China was really singled out as a spoiler and that Team Obama was disappointing. They had a national cap and trade bill in the House. It hadn't passed. The US's Copenhagen targets were dependent upon that. So Obama was disappointing. He did have a plan B to use executive powers, but it wasn't known at the time. When the parties kickstarted the negotiations for Paris in Durban in 2011, this was not something that the US or China were particularly interested in pushing. They had this flexible bottom-up Copenhagen model, suited them just nicely. It was the EU that really pushed that over the line. But by the second year, by 2013, once they'd sorted out the agenda and the parties started to make submissions towards this new agreement, applicable to all, it's very clear that that year of 2013 leading up to Warsaw was absolutely pivotal in shaping the landing zone of the Paris Agreement. And if you look at the mitigation architecture, the hybrid nature of the agreement, the flexible bottom-up approach where NDCs are housed outside the agreement, all of that can be tracked and traced to a series of submissions made by the US in 2013. China, for its part, retreated into a new group called the Like-Minded Group of Developing Countries, which formed in 2012 after the breakup of the basic group. And inside that group of developing countries, which included India, China played a very defensive diplomatic game, which rehearsed the well-known grievances of developing countries about the failure of developed countries to fulfill their expectation to lead in mitigation and the provision of climate finance. And they had a legitimate grievance there because it hasn't been fulfilled. China and inside the countries inside the like-minded developing group also insisted on this rigid binary between the annexes, industrialized and non-industrialized countries. It wanted to legalize the obligation of developed countries and not legalize the obligation of developing countries. And it did that all the way through until pretty much 2014, leading up to that. So when you get to the famous joint statement between the US and China in November 2014, this was a phenomenal boost to the confidence of the negotiations. Here you had the two biggest emitters make a joint announcement way ahead of what was required of their respective nationally determined contributions. Because back in 2013 at Warsaw, the EU had been pushing for internationally binding commitments. The US had come up with the formula of nationally determined contributions, and that won. The EU, along with some developing countries, were pushing for ex-ante equity review and science review and post-hoc review. That did not win major appeal, and China was one of the main countries resisting that. After that, the EU worked more cooperatively with the US. It just resigned to the fact that it was not going to get China and India on board to its more ambitious approach. So there was historic transatlantic cooperation on many issues between the EU and China, sorry, the EU and the US leading to Paris. But that joint statement, this is what everyone takes as, oh, the G2, the E2 if you like, have stood up and cooperated. They're both showing leadership. Well, I've done a series of interviews inside the State Department in the US, raking over their whole climate diplomacy leading to the US. And it was quite clear this was an Obama initiative that had started at least more than a year out from 2014 to orchestrate that statement. It was part of a larger push of bilateral diplomacy that included India, it wasn't quite as successful there, many other countries. And this is on the back of a longer period of cooperation on energy and other issues. So this was very much orchestrated by the US. But nonetheless, it was very important. And then in the road to Paris, after that, China just retreated back inside the like-minded group of developing countries. And it wasn't really until the end game of Paris that China came out and worked quite proactively with the US to get this agreement over the line. But of course, the way the whole architecture was lining up, it was not surprising that in 2015, you started to see some pushback from the more vulnerable parties to the negotiations. And we saw that in the form of the High Ambition Coalition, brainchild of the Marshall Islands, but the EU joined in quite early and it announced itself halfway through the negotiations and went public. And it had this sort of moral authority and had a snowballing effect with lots of countries, including the US, quite quickly joining. China didn't join till the very end after Brazil had joined. So it was even reluctant to support 1.5 degrees, which was part of the grand bargain of Paris. Incredible flexibility for the major emitters in return for stronger goals and temperature targets. There's always a grand bargain in there that you can see at the end when you look back. So what can we make of this narrative? Let me sum up, try and pull this together. It'll be a long summing up. So if you look at the quality of the proposals, by quality, I'm not saying quality in terms of getting us to a safe climate. I'm saying proposals that had wide appeal that actually would command agreement, given a long history of deadlock, right? You can compare the success of a treaty against the counterfactual of no agreement, which is how diplomats think. So any agreement's always a success. Or you can compare it to the counterfactual of the optimum. And to that, this is a disappointment. But to the counterfactual, it's a massive achievement. So the proposals were ones that stepped around the deep disagreement, just sidelined it, said, let's not go there anymore over what common but differentiated responsibilities means. Let's just step around that and have this nationally determined, bottom-up, as you were, approach to our nationally determined commitments. So get this breadth of participation in the first instance and then build ambition over time with regular upward ratcheting of ambition. This was something that China and the US could accept. The EU's proposals were not proposals China and India were prepared to accept. And a non-punitive, facilitative review were part of that. So this, of course, suited the Obama team because it stepped around a hostile Congress. So you might say it was self-serving, but it actually stepped around deep disagreement domestically and internationally, and therein lay its cleverness. If you look at advocacy, there was very strong advocacy, particularly Secretary of State John Kerry. I went to some of his presentations. He was like a preacher, like sweating, telling us the world was going to rack and ruin unless we adopted the US proposals. But certainly there was genuine commitment there in the negotiating team at the very highest level, and certainly Obama too, because this was a legacy issue for him, particularly in his second term. And he came out swinging, using everything he could. Adherence to the multilateral process, in great contrast to the debacle of Copenhagen, where the US, China, India, South Africa, and Brazil pretty much met in the dying embers of those negotiations and came up with the Copenhagen Accord, which wasn't adopted due to this spectacular failure of the process. And as I said, the US-China joint statement in 2014 didn't try and preempt the negotiations. It was simply a sign of the commitment of, I like to call the E2. And this was the US's initiative. Climate finance, the US did provide the biggest single contribution to climate finance. If you compare it on a per capita basis to EU countries, doesn't measure up as well, but it's all relative to the past rather than to the ideal that we want. And Obama had come out with a credible climate policy with his national climate plan. Again, the targets weren't particularly impressive, but they were much better than anything that had gone before. So he had at least credibility, although the US certainly didn't enjoy positional leadership in the ranking of ambition. No way. But it wasn't a laggard anymore, which made the difference to its diplomatic credibility. We turn and look at China. As I said, China retreated inside this, played a very defensive diplomatic role. And some of its 2013 submissions, it made one submission under its own name, and it was really kind of blunt. If you don't accept our insistence on maintaining this binary between the developed and developing world, then nothing will come of this agreement. Like, it was really saying, this is our red line. But of course, they changed later. By 2015, China's aggregate emissions were roughly double those of the US, and its per capita emissions were now higher than some OECD countries. China was under a lot of pressure then to start taking responsibility as a leader. And you could see this emerging in its statements. Its NDC was a really interesting read where it talked about taking responsibility. But the thing about China is its sense of responsibility and leadership was not to the world. It was to the developing world, to the G77. Whereas the way in which the US prosecuted its arguments, this was a global vision. This would work for everyone across the divide, whereas China saw itself as leading the developing world, not the world writ large. And that explains its diplomacy in lots of ways. Interestingly, China pushed hard to secure commitments on climate finance for developing countries. It was among the last to join the High Ambition Coalition, which would serve the interests of the least developed countries, and particularly low-lying Pacific Islands. Its finance, there was provisions put in the Paris Agreement for voluntary finance, which was code for recognising the fact that China was now providing climate finance too. But you've got to put that in a larger perspective. there's an incredible growth in China's investment and acquisitions and mergers in energy companies around the world. And the vast majority of this has gone not to renewable energy, but to fossil fuel. I can give you some references on that if you want. And of course, it's One Belt, One Road initiative is involving the export of coal-fired technology as well. So there's some contradictions there. And if you look at some of the survey data on perceptions of leadership leading up to Paris by Parker and Carlson, the US clearly was recognized as playing a bigger leadership role than China. Although when asked, I don't know what punters, when they were answering those survey questions, what idea of leadership they had in their head. If you don't prompt them with a particular version, given the different meanings of leadership, what can that survey data actually tell us? The irony of all of this is that China has done a lot more nationally than the US, right? Particularly with its 13th five-year plan, its massive investment in wind and solar, and its increasing mentioning of this national vision, and it's not a global vision, for China to become an ecological civilization. And so relative to past performance and in the time span, China has done more than the US. So you might say this is a puzzle. Why then did China not seize the opportunity to play a bigger leadership role? It had more to crow about than the US, most definitely, and that's a puzzle. The answer to that puzzle is that its national climate and energy policy is largely driven by domestic considerations, by shocking air quality in the major urban areas, a desire to restructure its economy, and so forth. And only secondarily by its desire to play a cooperative role in the Paris Agreement. I think it's very important to grasp that. So there's a kind of bitter irony there, because the US, I call this the last gasp of US leadership under the liberal international order. One of the biggest debates in IR in the world today is whether the liberal international order. And the fact that Obama was not able to play a leadership role domestically made it so easy for Trump to just tear it all up once he got into power by using executive regulations, had a hostile Congress. Can't go into the details of that, but it was not going to be a durable form of leadership nationally, and therefore the diplomatic leadership wouldn't last either, because it needed some measure of credibility at national action. Turn things around, as I said, China has done relatively more, but it didn't have the appetite for global leadership. And the big debate in IR at the moment is, what does China see its role in the international law, order as being? It's the Middle Kingdom once saw itself as the centre of the world, of the earth, and beyond that were barbarians. And then you had this century of humiliation in the 19th century, where it was forced to sign all these very unequal treaties with the British and so forth. And in the teaching of history in China, that century of humiliation, that 100 years of humiliation, is very much part of their national narrative. So what you see is dynasticism is replaced with nationalism. There's a sacralization of territory. There's a negative sovereignty discourse coming out of China. A critique of imperialism and racism, but its strong negative sovereignty discourse is all about good neighbours making good fences, and no pretenses at defending any universalistic discourse or ideas or vision for the world, because it sees its leadership as for the developing world, not for the world writ large. So I don't think in the short term that China's going to step into the so-called leadership vacuum. And I think the demise of the team Obama did create a vacuum, but I don't see China stepping into it anytime soon, unless it starts to resolve some of the contradictions in its international financing of energy, most of which goes to fossil fuels, and also some of the contradictions and governance problems nationally. Now, we had a seminar a few weeks ago by Jonah that showed some of those problems. They're generating far more energy than they can actually distribute and use because of failure of grid connectivity. There's a whole range of other issues as well. They're continuing to invest in supercritical coal plants. So this idea of ecological civilization is a very encouraging one. It's working at some levels. There's more centralization taking place. But for those who subscribe to the fantasy, if only our country was an authoritarian regime led by a benign dictator who was absolutely convinced that we needed a zero carbon world, well, think again, because there was a documentary made in 2015 called Under the Dome. Has anyone heard about that? Where a well-known Chinese television reporter had lost her baby in her womb due to a tumour which she attributed to bad air quality. This film got millions of viewers, I think about 150 million in 4 days, and then it was censored and then banned very quickly. So clearly the Chinese Communist Party is very sensitive to this and wanting to respond to the citizens' concern about air quality, but that gets back to this argument about domestic consideration. So going forward, because we have Xi Jinping for life, if he were to decide that he wanted to promote a less contradictory and more concerted program of moving China towards an ecological civilization, and to make that a global vision, then we'd see a significant turnaround. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. Stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Robyn. I'm sure we'll now open the floor for questions. And I think for viewers online, feel free to type in your questions and we'll get them along. Questions?
We've got all the time in the world.
Hi, Robyn. Hi, thanks so much for a very interesting presentation. It's just sort of the obvious question, if not the US and China, you know, given that idea of leadership that you talked about at the start of needing to kind of take the globe or the collective somewhere, I wondered who else, you know, the EU springs to mind, any of the other sort of key players, and if you could talk about that briefly. Thank you.
Because I'm saying China's not going to assume a global visionary leadership role doesn't mean that China's not going to remain cooperative with the Paris Agreement, right? Because it's concordant with its domestic policy. But the common wisdom of those who study Chinese foreign policy, that the only thing that is consistent about Chinese foreign policy is that it's inconsistent and deeply pragmatic. So you see conformity with multilateralism and the rule of law in some areas, and you hear the Chinese discourse talking about that, and we hear that about Paris. You don't see it with the law of the sea. You don't see it with piracy issues and so forth. So China will continue to play a cooperative role, but that's not the same as leadership. And there's talk about a new C5, China, India, the EU, South Africa. How many is that? That's 4. Can't remember what the other one was. That's a possibility. There's a lot of bilateral diplomacy happening between the EU and China at the moment. But what I'm interested in is, what is China's role in the world? What type of revisionist power is it? Or is it a revisionist power? Is it happy with its status in the world at the moment? And IR scholars often divide that into 3 types of revisionism: either radical, where you want to break the rules and remake them; reformist, where you want to work within the rules to transform them; or orthodox, where you just want to acquire more status within those rules, a little bit more say. And it's probably somewhere between those 2. But on the other hand, maybe it wants to become a regional hegemon, maybe building, if not an empire, then a kind of suzerain order where the states around it pay tribute to China and have their foreign policy consistent with China, but don't get interference with their domestic policy. These are some of the things that are mooted. So this sense that there's something unique about the Chinese civilization and its history that they want to hold on to, and the sacralization of territory, which is very important in Chinese foreign policy, that's one thing that is consistent. I can't see China playing a global visionary role. And it's hard to see any power playing a global visionary role. IR scholars have been unable to characterize the changing international order. If things are happening too quickly and we don't know what adjective to put on it, we still call it the post-Cold War period. Define it by what went before, because there are too many aspects to it for one feature to stand out and say that's how we characterize it. So we're losing all these certainties. Clearly it's multilateral, multipolar, and it straddles the north and the south in a way it never has before. That's new. But China and India, their economic rise has been absolutely facilitated by the neoliberal economic order that the US largely sponsored. So I don't think they're going to challenge that. But in other areas, certainly in international finance, China's happy it's on the P5, India isn't. But I won't see a reform of the UN Security Council anytime soon. So all these larger questions help to make sense of how we might think China might play a role in the climate regime. And I see a continuation of a cooperative role. And that's a good thing. I just don't see a visionary leadership role of the kind that Obama tried to play. He was a man with a vision, but he just couldn't bring the US alongside him domestically, or certainly Congress. And therein lies the tragedy.
We have a question from online view.
Yes. Natasha, can you speak?
Yes. Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, hi. I just wanted to ask, how do you think that President Trump can best balance the interests of the constituents who actually voted him in with the US's responsibility to engage with the rest of the world, whether it be through the Paris Agreement or through other measures?
Well, Trump has no interest in doing that, of course. Well, it seems daft to be trying to kill renewable energy when it's got far more job prospects than the old economy he's trying to prop up. That seems the most obvious, blindingly obvious answer to the question. But he even lacks the subtlety to recognise that. But that would be my first response. I mean, the growth in jobs in the US in that field is quite considerable. And it's, with a bit of careful investment and direction investment into the old coal regions, like the Appalachians and so forth, you might be able to get, reinvigorate some local economies that are clearly suffering and bleeding. But of course, a lot of the people working in those communities are suffering terrible health effects from coal dust. So it's not like they're really being well served by working in a coal community anyway. So that would be my first best response.
Hi, Robyn. Thanks very much for the presentation. I was interested in your conceptualization of leadership. And I guess the example that you sort of drew from most heavily was the UNFCCC sort of formal state-led negotiation process.
Yep.
It strikes me that one of the other changes that's kind of happened over the last decade at least is really this kind of complexity, the kind of multi-level nature of interactions across states. So not just driven by states, but by non-state actors and different levels of the state as well. So I'd be really interested to hear your reflections on, in this sort of more complex world of interactions, how does that change your views about leadership? Do we need state-led leadership going forward? What does good leadership or good diplomatic leadership look like in this kind of more complex environment?
Well, the conceptualization that I offered you is capacious enough to cover political leadership at any level of social aggregation, from the street gang to the UN, right? And so, but the point is not to conflate what some global environmental governance scholars call directional leadership, where you set an example to show the way, which is fantastic, with what I call substantive leadership. Because if you do that and no one follows, it's not substantive leadership. Substantive leadership requires asymmetric influence by some parties leading, guiding others towards some collective goal, right? And so setting an example is really important in helping to build that. But if you do good things and no one follows, then that's what those scholars would call directional leadership, but it's not substantive leadership. But if you set an example and there are examples of emulation somewhere elsewhere, then you can say, yes, I've established that, I've got followership. So leadership presupposes followership in a substantive sense. So when you think about folk who are really good climate advocates, who really believe in it and have been spending a long time trying to build support, they're called climate leaders too. I think they're better just called climate advocates, because you have to point to the followership in that sense. And insofar as you do, even if it's a small community, like negotiating coalitions often have an unacknowledged leader, like the umbrella group. Often the US is the unacknowledged leader, although that's a very loose coalition, doesn't have a formal voting structure or anything. So with any group, you need to demonstrate that. But climate advocacy, you'd say in the field of climate advocacy, these people stand taller than others. So that's actually a positional form of leadership. It's a relative ranking of the strength of your conviction and your ability to argue. So in that sense, as soon as you move from substantive to positional, it's a ranking in a field, performance of something. And in this case, it's moral climate advocacy or scientific climate advocacy, whatever you call it. So that's a ranking. But I always look for where's the influence, right? So take Al Gore. His climate leadership project is about advocacy and planting people in all sorts of organizations. And insofar as they start to change things, that's leadership. And so far as they don't, they're climate advocates that are unsuccessful, therefore haven't established a degree of followership. And that followership can be small or large. There's always some followership, but you need to identify it because sociologically speaking, you need to find that relationship. But to answer the main point of your question, it's absolutely important that states like Victoria, local governments, cities, businesses, other organizations do engage in directional leadership and reach out and try and facilitate others to follow and show the way. That's fantastic. And there's a lot of research looking at that because that despite all the celebration of Paris, there's a sort of feeling of gloom setting in. The window's narrowing. We've got increasing observable evidence of increasingly dangerous climate change. And without everyone throwing their best shot in it, then I'm not sure we're going to get very far. So these are analytical tools that I use. And I don't think I'm going to change everyone's speech and the way they use leadership across all these different dimensions. But for me, if I don't pin that down and distinguish it in terms of those two categories, it just really helps me think through all the confusion about leadership.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Shall I go? Hi, Robyn. Thanks very much for that interesting presentation. I was wondering if you could reflect on Australia's role as a leader in the climate change negotiations. So we have faced domestic policy issues, but we have chaired the umbrella group of countries in the UNFCCC, which includes the US, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, Norway. So some of the biggest emitters in the world, and we have co-chaired the Green Climate Fund. So they're just a couple of the leadership positions that Australia has taken. I was wondering if you could reflect on our role in the lead up to Paris and what our potential leadership role could be if we can get our domestic ducks in line.
Well, Australia is not a leader. It's a shocking laggard. There's no other way of putting it, right? Nationally, no Prime Minister has managed to lead on climate change in terms of securing the passage of robust legislation on climate and energy, right? So I have no problem pronouncing that about Australia at the national level. Internationally, it's interesting because, if you didn't know anything about Australia's national policy and saw our negotiators in action, they do some good things in some areas on transparency and this and that and climate finance, and they can spruik that. But it's merely camouflaging something that we all know, which is their pathetic national action. And I remember at Durban in 2011, lining up to go into the plenary to hear all the ministerial speeches. And Greg Combet walked past, the climate minister. And this is after the Clean Energy Future Package had just been enacted. And strangely, this piece of legislation had gone through at a period in the negotiations where not much was happening elsewhere. He got this clap wherever he went. He was walking through the halls towards the plenary, and in the plenary, everyone was just cheering him. It's like, here's a little ray of hope. Right? But we know the fossil fuel award is given by the NGOs, the climate negotiations every year at the summit. I think Australia's got more gongs for fossil of the day, fossil of the week, fossil of the conference than most other countries apart from Saudi Arabia. So that's not saying much. So the leadership is itty-bitty leadership on little technical issues, but in terms of the substantive issues, no credibility. And if you look at the negotiations at Kyoto, the sneaky thing they did on land clearing and how they're doing all these sneaky negotiations to carry forward their surplus, AAUs and so forth. There's a lot of shenanigans going on there too. So disingenuous, bad faith negotiations, just looking after their own. That's my short answer to that.
Robyn, thanks very much. I want to go back to the previous answer where your focus on normative leadership was starting to come through a little more strongly. I just wonder if while I agree with your conclusions, I just wonder if you have focused a little too much on the size is everything answer to the question of leadership, and underplayed the influence of smaller players who both normatively and in other forms have actually shaped the negotiations and the outcomes much more successful. I'm reminded in the sense of, Martin Luther King's last speech where he says, I've seen the promised land, but I may not get there. A great deal of leadership can occur without substantive outcomes in the immediate circumstances of that leadership. So if you look at the influence of the small island states, if you look at the influence of the EU, if you look at the influence of states within the EU, such as Germany, and the UK, where substantive outcomes have been exemplary in comparison with China and the US, I wonder if the notion of leadership that you're operating with has contracted far too quickly to a focus on diplomatic leadership, which you're confusing perhaps with substantive leadership. I'd suggest that neither the US nor China have been leaders. They're not likely to become leaders either. And if you look at the long trajectory of the negotiations, you look for leadership elsewhere, both in terms of normative leadership, the Scandinavian states, the small island states, the EU. And that's where leadership lies, even if the outcomes of what they've been proposing haven't come to fruition. They've provided a safety net and a box within which to operate.
The conceptualisation of leadership is capacious enough to deal with what I call distributed leadership in complex negotiations. I mean, if you asked who led Paris to a successful conclusion, the answer is a cast of thousands, right? So this paper is merely analysing the relative role of the US and China. I wouldn't for a minute say we should not focus on other players. Clearly, the French presidency played a significant role. Clearly, the High Ambition Coalition, which was the brainchild of Tony de Bruyn from the Marshall Islands, played a big role. Clearly, a lot of NGOs played a big role, and Mike Jacobs has written an article saying the NGOs led Paris to a successful conclusion. And when you've got so many complex negotiating items, I mean, at any one day there'd be more than 150 separate negotiations taking place. So leadership is not only distributed, but shifting around different items and packages of items. So this paper is merely looking at the not everything in the Paris Agreement, but the basic mitigation architecture and hybrid nature of the agreement and the flexible approach. There's no doubt that's got the US's paw prints all over it. So in terms of asymmetric influence, the basic shaping of it, I've read all the submissions. It can be a direct line. You can look at it and go back and look at 2 submissions in 2013 and it's all there. And they successfully pushed that all the way through, and other bits fell by the wayside. There was lots of accommodation and concessions, and 1.5 degrees was the best thing about the Paris Agreement. And that was the pushback from vulnerable parties. So yes, there's also, and Tony de Bruyn meant that the High Ambition Coalition just had this moral leadership. And it was, everyone wanted to clamber aboard and get some of that moral sunshine on them and the photo opportunities. And it was when Australia wanted to join at the very end, Tony de Bruyn said, well, I don't know whether you've got any credentials to bring to the table here. And at the New York signing ceremony, they were locked out of High Ambition Coalition negotiations. Australia just didn't cut it. It didn't have the moral fibre. So I totally agree. And there's lots of things that can be done. But this paper was prepared for a workshop on great powers and the environment. So there's a whole other theoretical component to it about special responsibilities. And if anyone wants a copy of it, I can provide it as a workshop paper. What I presented today is just pulling out the leadership aspect of it. But there's no doubt that, can you imagine a successful agreement without the participation of China and the US? And that's why there's so much focus on the big emitters. They're less likely to have the moral commitment, right? But with great moral commitment and little capability, there are limits to what you can do when there's great capability and not much moral commitment. And this is a real problem. You know, you need, this is a collective action problem. You need so many emissions covered, if not all, to get over the line. And the prospects of that are really dim now. Over the line, I mean, over 1.5 degrees, very dim. Which is why this is important, you know, the focus on China now in the interim. We can't just tread water, but I think what we're going to see is a holding pattern. That's the tragedy of it. But by all means, I think the more you get grassroots action at the local and city level and the national level, you build a base, you make it easier for the diplomats. They've got you know, in this way, the leadership can come from below, distributed leadership in terms of NGOs, moral advocates and all the rest of it. And that hard work, if it actually can shift the population and make it easier for politicians to make what they think are too hard decisions. But the other way around, you often say when you've got a wicked problem that's got layers of complexity and technicality in science, economics and policy, then you actually need leadership by the political executive to build support for that and develop a narrative of responsibility that can enact that cut through the technical complexity. And what we're not seeing in the debates over the last 2 weeks, I mean, the journalists are failing us here too. What on earth is the problem we're trying to solve here? Yes, we're all concerned about electricity prices, but they've gone up for reasons that have nothing to do with climate change or climate policy. And there's this terrible misinformation and scapegoating. I mean, the coalition, the right-wing rump that voted for, I was going to say Mr. Potato Head, but I'll just say Peter Dutton. They're saying, we're not going to outsource our sovereignty to Paris. I mean, it's like, that's a Trumpism if ever there was one, because our Paris targets are nationally determined and they were determined by the Abbott government. What on earth are they saying? And people go, oh no, we're not going to outsource our sovereignty. So there's no leadership in terms of directional leadership and a narrative about taking responsibility by putting the problem up there first and explaining we have solutions. There are solutions here and we need to build and guide this collective action, build support. We're not seeing it. It's about the opposite of what I've theorized here in terms of legitimate leadership. So it's more likely to come below and the politicians will be the last to get the news when they can see enough support in the electorate. That's the only way we can do it. And that's going to be slow.
Can't you then reflect that comment into the narrative about the US and China? Well, it's not leadership, it's sort of a path to towards it.
Yeah. Well, it's just that you have to use like a generic sociological account of leadership, but then you have to filter it through the institutions in which agreement's made, through particular political institutions, or in this case, the institution of multilateralism and the way things work. And so you can only build a coalition of support within your coalitions and other coalitions, and you get a critical mass and then other people fall into line. That's how it works. And so who's had the biggest or the most asymmetric influence in doing that in a way that's actually build support? It was the US proposal because it was pragmatic and flexible. It aimed for the widest possible participation and then building of ambition. That's what got everything over the line. It was that architecture. I'm not saying it's going to solve the problem. Don't for a minute interpret me as saying that. But diplomatically, this is a form of political leadership, not moral leadership. And I'm looking at political leadership here. It can include moral leadership and advocacy, and you certainly saw that from John Kerry. But when you saw what they were doing nationally, they couldn't do any more than they could. So this is why it's the last gasp of, you know, a US administration trying to lead with a global vision, but they couldn't back it up nationally. That's the irony of it.
Hi, thanks, Robyn.
Hey,
hi.
Jeremy, I recognise your voice.
So I was trying to think more about the idea of a universal that's coming through, that leadership involves some proclaiming of a universal idea of how things should go forward. And we saw in the Cold War the two contending parties both had universal ideologies. The sort of justice ideology died, you know, in 1990 with the end of the Soviet Empire, and it seems we're currently in the period of the death of the liberal version of that universal ideology, and that maybe we're entering some sort of a pluriversal rather than universal.
Pluralism is the key word, yeah.
And so I'm wondering what leadership means in that context, where we're not going to ever get US or China or anyone having a universal vision that's able to be presented, but they have to find ways to muddle through in this pluriversal way, and that in that context maybe China is leading, just not in a good direction.
Yeah.
From a climate
you can have a leader in a bad direction for sure. Yeah. No, I think the word universal is red rag to a bull for a post-colonialist of any kind, or what is critical of Western imperialism for sure. By universal, I was using it fairly loosely. It was more coming up with a proposal that could potentially command universal agreement by 196 parties. And that therefore has to be a pluralistic proposal. I mean, if you track the way the debates about climate justice have travelled over 2 decades, it's really interesting. You had climate justice people coming up with all these wonderful ideal accounts of what climate justice would be procedurally or substantively, or in terms of recognition, if you think of those 3 dimensions of justice. And here's the one true way, here's the one true way. And then it became increasingly recognised that there were a variety of reasonable accounts of what climate justice can mean. It's a bit like Rawls's idea, a variety of reasonable accounts and then some that are beyond the pale, which I think is true insofar as they're disingenuous, right? But that pluralism is acknowledged now in the environmental ethics, environmental justice community, just as it's acknowledged in the climate negotiating community. We have to live and work with pluralism and disagreement. But that had been, we just had this deadlock for so long. It was like Groundhog Day. Every negotiation's the same repertoire of arguments were coming from all these forces and they weren't connecting. So the architecture of the Paris Agreement just deftly stepped around that. And that was the only way I could see us getting forward. The problem with China, it has a negative sovereignty discourse, but in a sense it's consistent with realism that all you need are rules of coexistence. That's the only thing, or it's a communitarian realist approach, you might say, that the only thing we need to agree upon beyond pursuing our national interests and our national ends are rules of coexistence that stop warfare and respect for sovereignty and national self-determination. And that is the negative sovereign discourse that China pushes, which is very different to the spread of liberalism idea, both economic and political liberalism, that the US has prosecuted, particularly since 1945. And I could tell that story deeply if you want to. So that said, this is a civilizational challenge and there's a huge amount at stake. So I don't balk at the idea of us trying to develop a sense of our connectedness as a civilization globally, given that we're all subjected to this, and they're obviously in various ways, but no one can hide from this. Subsequent generations less so over time. So having some sense of that, and I think is really important. And you can do that in a kind of pluralist way, I think. So I'm still not going to let go of the idea of this vision thing, because it can be galvanizing. It's part of the collective project we're trying to build, the collective goal and the collective means for getting there that are considered fair. So I take your point. It's a problematic term, but all I can do is explain that anything more than what the US proposed wouldn't have commanded collective agreement. And fortunately, they were prepared to make concessions to 1.5 degrees and temperature targets and so forth to give the Paris Agreement some credibility, which can be used to beat up major emitters to say you're not doing enough. You agree to this goal, but you're doing nothing that's consistent with reaching that goal. Without that, we have nowhere to stand.
Thanks, Robyn. It seems to be the view, if not expressed publicly yet, of well-informed insiders that the coming IPCC report on 1.5 will be so compromised as not to be a credible document, and some are saying privately it may presage the end of the IPCC as a useful organisation. I mean, certainly the Hothouse Earth paper 2 weeks ago, which apparently has had 250,000 downloads for an academic paper in 2 weeks, may be a more useful forum for discussion than the next IPCC report. I wonder, given that John Schellnhuber said this week that we're in the climate policy endgame, whether likewise, whether UNFCCC has the governance, procedures and structures useful for the moment that's now at hand?
I think that's a really serious point. And I just had this flash of inspiration. I was thinking of the various G7 summits. Back in the 90s, what you saw in parallel to those summits was the other economic summit called TOES. And you'd have a range of non-orthodox economists, ecological economists, grassroots activists, academics, a veritable rainbow of participants pushing forward alternative ideas for the national and global economy that were fairer and so forth. So what's to stop another economic summit, the other climate summit, happening in parallel to the climate summit with a different, more rigorous scientific paper on 1.5 degrees and those implications, and the sort of targets and timetables that are really needed to drive that, just to expose what's been watered down, because the IPCC is a is a weird beast. It's not purely, it's a political animal, let's face it. And the way they have to reach consensus line by line means it's just going to be adulterated all the way through. So it needs to be exposed, would be my response. I'm not sure what else. What would you do? And what would you propose? I mean, other than critical publicity.
Well, I mean, my only thought was that the Hothouse paper 2 weeks ago seemed, on non-linearity in the system, and that at 2 degrees you might have feedbacks that take you beyond control, which is sort of a interesting proposition and something that Jim Hansen and so on have been saying for 15 years. It's essentially not new. But that seemed to provoke a great deal of interest, more so than an IPCC report does in a way, because given that Paris, a series of unenforceable voluntary agreements, is currently tagging at 3.4 without feedbacks and 4 or 5 with feedbacks, and we've now got scientists saying 2 degrees may not, but it's in the range of really big trouble. I mean, these are contradictions which are now extremely urgent, and I can't see the UNFCCC processes actually resolving them. I mean, partly because of the same governance procedures of lowest common denominator outcomes. Well, as opposed to some leadership from a number of government and non-government actors who actually decide to go out and try and do something different.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Paris Agreement has put it all back at the national level now. And then that's a good reason for doing more subnational action to make it easier at the national level. Although there's an obligation to increase your mitigation in each cycle of review, there's no obligation to have achieved the last one. Whereas under Kyoto, if you didn't, you were penalised in the next round. And because of that, Canada, under Harper, shamelessly walked away from the Kyoto Agreement. And there was no consequence. I mean, what do you do? All I can say is I take your point. And I think, when you think of the debate over the last week nationally, that no one is bringing into view what's at stake here. No one's bringing into view Australia's reputation internationally and what that's going to mean as a hegemon in the Pacific, as a member of international society and so forth, and what that means for present and future generations of Australians. It's unbelievably lopsided and fixated on leadership struggles and then prices of energy, and it's obfuscation all the way down. It's woeful. So clearly we need, I'm dreaming of the day we have some conservative climate change champions. Because for so long as we don't, we're going to be stuck in this awful toxic politics. And there's a few out there, and there's John Hewson, if you call him a champion, it's all relative. He is by comparison to most conservatives. They're precious few, but maybe some big business might finally say, we're sick and tired of this. Even we'll start some advocacy here, because they're operating in global markets and they're worrying about financial risk, the need for disclosure and all of those kinds of things. It may well be litigation and fear of litigation that might actually drive these changes in the end, the big stick rather than anything else. But it's a sad scenario.
Yes, so thank you very much. If only we could stop the hands of time, but time has run out. So we can pick this conversation, I think, afterwards. But I think the key thing is that at least we now have some conceptual tools of thinking about sort of leadership, whether at the subnational, national, or international level, especially as we head towards the critical timeline of getting the rules to implement the Paris Agreement ready by the end of the year. So I think without much ado, thank you very much, Robyn, and thank you everyone for your questions and answers.
Thanks.
I think just a few announcements. We have, so this is one of quite a number of other seminars coming up, and I think it's good we started on the concept of leadership, and we'll be extending that concept in a sort of national context next week, Wednesday, same venue, where we have a very distinguished commentator on the recent sort of debates on the National Energy Guarantee fiasco. And that's our very own Dylan. So you're very much welcome here next week. That's on the Wednesday, the 29th, 11 a.m. to 12 p.m., where he'll unpack some of these issues and we can sort of pass a verdict on whether there's leadership or not, even though I'm sure some people have an answer in their mind. So after that, on Monday 3rd, we have another seminar, preview of BZE's electrifying industry. That's a collaboration with the chemistry, department. That will be in the chemistry building. And finally, we have one more seminar on Wednesday, 5th September, on dealing with uncertainty, reflections on the role of projecting regional climate change. I think that will be here. All the details are on our website on the events tab, so feel free to sign up and then you'll get all the other details. I think unless Malte has any other sort of comments, thank you once again. I think let's give Robyn one last round of applause.